Okay, thank you for having me here today. I'm very happy about this occasion. So the title of my presentation today is Uncovering the Forces of the Transition, a typo-morphological reading of transformation in the Est Ensemble. So the general aim of this presentation for me is to, in a way, discuss a method on how to formulate a basis to explore the capacity of typology, or as you will see in my case, rather of typomorphology, to be a critical tool to observe a spatial transformation in time, and maybe also to uncover the forces which are behind this transformation. And we are today in a specific context. It's a context which in academic discourse, but also in urban planning and in general in public policy, we refer to as the ecological transition in some cases, and in some other, let's say, cases, also the ecological and socio-economic transition, although this still remains quite a very marginal definition in the context of the transition. So I would like to start by introducing an interpretation of the notion of crisis. Normally we tend to associate crisis with the meaning of a disaster, of a catastrophe. On the other hand, there is the Greek root which suggests in a way a different meaning, which is a meaning of separating, distinguish, decide, choose, and even explain. And in this sense, if we think about crisis according to this second interpretation, we can imagine the crisis as something that is conceived as an ambiguous phase where some transformations are happening and where, in a way, we have to make choices. We have to make choices, and we also need to be able to explain why we are making these choices. So building upon this interpretation, one can refer to this distinction, which is brought about by Muratori in the publication Studi per un'operante storia urbana di Venezia, which is also one of the reference I use for typological analysis. And he distinguishes the spontaneous consciousness. So this is basically the attitude of a subject to, in a way, adapt to its environment without the need of any kind of deep struggle, but rather simply, living in quite of a normal way. And this is what prevails in non-crisis historical interludes. And on the other hand, Muratori proposes the critical consciousness, which is the case in which the operating subject is in a way forced to choose what to do. And is forced to do so out of uncertainty, and in a way, in a certain absence of a collective codification, and also in the absence of a really rooted way of operating. So today, against the background of the climate crisis, and alongside many other types of crises, actually, we are clearly in a context of this critical consciousness. So we could say that in a way, we are in a moment which is very uncertain, and where we are in search of this collective codification and this really rooted way of operating. So as a matter of fact, if we think of the notion of transition today, it's actually still quite a vague and undefined concept. We are not really sure what it means in a way. It's of course a character that is given by the word transition itself, so already using that word admits a certain uncertainty. But beyond that, we had also to acknowledge that there are a series of different transition paradigms, which means that there are different ways through which we can address this transition. And I think that this plurality could be interpreted in two ways, in the sense there are two different natures of this plurality. On one sense, we could very simply and very superficially almost say that there are different political directions, there are different strategies, policies, and also different spatial outcomes, of course. But on the other hand, we could interpret this plurality in a different way and put on the table the term radicality, meaning that there are, let's say, different radicalities, in the sense that we could be willing to tackle societal change at different radicalities. So in other words, it means the depth at which we're willing to retrace the path of the roots of what today we identify as crisis. So what I argue here basically is to maintain a certain criticality towards this term of the transition, in the sense that, just to make an example, if we look at the environmental crisis, merely, let's say, on its own, we are actually barely scratching the surface of the problem. Whether if we try to pose ourselves some, let's say, deeper questions, so we try to understand, okay, but what are actually the societal roots behind this superficial environmental crisis, then that's the point where you're actually touching the roots of the real problem. So a question for us who are working with space, all that said, is which types of cities are emerging under this plurality of transition paradigm? So as we know, we are in context of very deep transformation, so we can imagine that very different models and types of city might be emerging. And so to discuss this perspective and in a way also to anchor it to space, I will present a case study of urban transformation, which for now, let's say, it belongs to the general paradigm of the transition. And we are here in the Grand Paris, one of the many territories of the Grand Paris, and specifically we are in the Est Ensemble, which is a policy unit that was formed in 2010, so it's already going and active. And it's between 9 municipalities, and as you can see, it's really just outside the periphery of Paris. And it's a project of transformation that is led by a very complex body of strategies and policies. But I will not, of course, enter into it now, but I want to sum up maybe just a general aim. In fact, it's between autonomy and integration, in the sense that they're looking for certain autonomy from the Grand Paris in terms of decision-making, urban planning, so in a way to detach from, let's say, bigger decision-making. On the other hand, they seek a certain integration, meaning acquiring more territorial relevance. Another, let's say, double ambition, which is probably more crucial for what we're discussing today, is an ambition between exemplarity. So this ambition of explicitly wanting to be a model for the transition. In fact, the motto of this part of the territory is pour le climat, la justice sociale, dog for climate and social justice. While at the same time reinforcing a specificity, which is being the so-called Fabrique of the Grand Paris. And in fact, we find ourselves in a specific part of the Grand Paris, because it's a territory that's really historically marked by the spaces of production, which have always led its development, so since its early stages. So after many periods of economic crisis, actually, which took over the territory at different times, at different stages, the project of this Est Ensemble aims at relaunching this role of this part of the territory in creating new jobs, facilitating new enterprises, and so on. And so what I found actually, particularly interesting here is this ambition of on one side, let's say, linking a project for the transition together with the project of economic development. And I think this could be a really tricky point in trying to bring the two things together. So this for the general strategy. But before entering into the case study, I also would like to precise here the unit of analysis in such a vast territory, which correspond to what in my presentation I conceive here as type, knowing that, of course, the notion of type can actually have many different scales. The notion of type is transcalar. And so I built on a specific definition upon the book Lettura dell'edilizia di base by Caniggia MFA, which were actually coming from the line of the before mentioned Muratori. And the unity of type I consider is the aggregate. So the aggregate is made up of a system of formative laws and progressive mutation, and the elementary module of the aggregate is the plot. And ultimately, let's say the typological process that invests the aggregate identifies the type of urban fabrics that you're facing. So the study of the aggregate that I will here present briefly, or let's say the attempt of the study of the aggregate is here organized through a number of transcalar operations, being first of all the representation of the initial condition. So what is the present morphological and functional condition? Then this is, let's say, the step 0 in a way. The first step is the historical reconstruction and the genesis of the built environment. The second is the individuation of permanences of the typical urban fabric. And the third, which unfortunately I don't have the time to enter into today, but it's about selecting permanent and endogenous type. So the territory, as you can imagine, is quite complex and quite vast. So I decided to really choose just two different types of urban fabrics. So I propose to you here two samples. Starting from the condition 0, both of these examples, they revolve around the role of the spaces of production, which you see in blue. On the red, you see the space of the living, and on the yellow, the services and the commercial spaces. And you see in the example to the left that it's a very high degree of mixity. It's a very fine-grained urban fabric, especially at the heart of this map. And to the right, you see what resembles more to a monofunctional platform, which then relates to other patches of residential urban fabric all around. And so the question basically for me looking at this condition is, how do these urban fabrics deal with transformation? So how do they deal in general with crisis? And how do they deal with the project of transition that is here envisaged in this case? So really, this is important because it consists on the condition on which we have to operate this critical consciousness that I was referring to at the beginning of the presentation. So I'll start going through the, the first operation, which here consists of an historical reconstruction of, let's say, the genesis of this part of the territory. And the way in which the maps that I will show you are constructed are basically that there is a selected frame, which represents the same frame of 2 kilometers, which you have just seen. And let's say the elements that you see that escape this frame are actually those elements who have participated in the formation of the built environment. So basically, they are those elements which have in a way shaped the city. And knowing that they're not just morphologies that we represent, but also they correspond to political entities, or let's say in general to entities of power. So here, for instance, we see the, let's say, the first signs of settlements, which were actually the first cloisters. We see the canal, we see the main road. I will not enter into much detail because I really rather would like to show you the methodology of what I'm trying to do. And so we see the first traces of the built environment, and very importantly also the organization of these agricultural fields in these very long and narrow plots. I actually have done quite a long series of these maps, but for each example I will just show you today 3 for each example. Here, for instance, we see the role of the fortification, which also, of course, really a morphology of power itself, which creates this very strict caesura with Paris, and therefore also the concentration of the densification along certain privileged axes, which were the ones that were actually entering the city. A third moment, a more recent one, is actually the moment of, let's say, the peak of densification. In this map that you see, the darker red are actually the residential spaces, and in the hatch, the more lighter red, you actually see the spaces of production, so the industries and the manufacturing spaces of production. And here we start to see how really the figure of the railway becomes really a leading figure in this context. We see how the fortification that I showed before have been demolished, no? And so this means that void starts having a role in this process of densification. So really the role of open spaces becomes crucial in a way, and also becomes the rationality that in a way limits the densification itself, no? So so this for the first example. I will go briefly through the second example. We find ourselves here at the foot of a plain, actually. You see in this map the topography, which is cutted out, which is clearly marked in this historical map, which has been actually maintained agriculture for a long time for its privileged position. But here we see now the consolidation of these first core settlements. And this part was actually called, it's often found in the historical maps, it's often called the bas pays, so meaning the lowland. And it starts now being surrounded by a series of urban figures. So again, the fortification, a series of gravel pits, which exploited the height of the plateau, and of course the infrastructure. And finally, we arrive here again to the densification of this bas pays, which basically happened through the industries. So where the railway again becomes this leading territorial figure, and the system of open spaces, which is also inherited mostly from this former gravel pit, so it's still an open space that is in a way linked to the rationality of production, limits here the densification. So through this map, I've tried to in a way clarify the genesis of these examples, which were led each time by specific figures and the power behind these figures, with the aim of understanding the environment through its genesis. And in fact, if we refer to variations of identity and citing Carlos Martiris, we can say how history and typology actually are part of the same process. They're in a way complementary. And in fact, while history shows us the processes of transformation, on the other hand, typological analysis focuses on what in this same process actually remains the same. So basically the permanence. So maybe now we could shift the attention to what actually remains the same, what is permanent through change. We enter into this second operation. This study is done on an urban fabric which represents the typical aggregate of this selected part of the territory. This is specifically, this one is an urban fabric which stems from the 19th century Faubourg. And at the base of the process, we find the structures of elementarity, which in this case are these very long and narrow plots, which host functions of living, producing, or even both on the same plot. And here we can see just an explanation of the legend in the thick black lines, the plot which actually remained the same since the first edification, so what muratori, caniggia, etc. would call prima edificazione, I segni di prima edificazione. The thin line represents the actual plots, and the dotted represents the plots which were removed in time. And so what is very clearly, what we can see very clearly is how the structure of long and narrow plots in a way still remains very present today, which gives us a hint, which gives us an insight on a certain culture of living and of producing, and the relationship between the two in this portion of territory. So a really tight relationship between these two. And actually, in its origin, the houses were actually placed along the borders of the plots, and the inside of the urban blocks was rather for cultivating, and afterwards it started to become densified through the industries, and it was the densification, therefore, that was really led by the spaces of production. Here we see the permanence of the built environment in time through a series of milestones. For instance, the first, la prima edificazione, so the moment where we find the first traces. The second milestones would be what we call the intasamento or addensamento, meaning really the peak of a certain densification, which here corresponds to the peak of industrialization. And finally, we see the transformation linked to this project of the Est Ensemble, which, as I already mentioned, has been active since 10 years. So we actually see that these long and narrow plots really remain the unity of transformation in this specific type. So what we could say of this aggregate consists, first of all, that, okay, it's a mixed-use living and working urban fabric. And through the vocabulary of Caniggia and Maffei, it would be, its dynamic would be synthesized in a systematic serial, meaning that there is a series of the same type of unit in a serial system. And if you observe the dynamic of transformation of this urban fabric, we could call it a path dependence, in the sense that only the transformations which are admitted in this urban fabric are the ones that do not alter the rationality of the same urban fabric. So there is, in a way, this resistance of the fabric in accepting endogenous morphologies. So now we've seen this first aggregate with this very specific structure. I will just jump to the second. Here we are, as you can see, in a very completely different case. It's actually a case of much later industrialization, which took over the plains of this plateau I showed you before. And the industrialization which took over here was one of very large and powerful industries, which were, in this case, differently from the first case, completely disconnected from the workers' housing. So now really this establishment of this very large platform. Also, it was, of course, related by the type of production that was happening, because in the first case, it was more manufacturing production, also very small production, which could be welcomed in this type of urban fabric. And here we had, for instance, the sector of the pharmaceutical, the biotechnology, so really a different type of industrialization. And here we see a structure of the plot which is not really reconductible to the type, differently from the first case. And what you can observe is its dynamic of transformation, which, contrary to the previous case, is very, very malleable in terms of dimension, in terms of morphology of its plot. And as a matter of fact, we see really this merging of smaller plots in this larger area. I would like to jump from here to the second map. I hope you can see the disappearance of the thick back lines, because this is actually part of one of the projects that are envisaged in this area. So this would be actually the transformation which will be happening in the next years. Actually, they're starting to build in the next month. And so we can really this merging of the plots as is almost with the tabula rasa logic is even more striking. So if you look at the evolution of this built environment, we can see at first maybe a clear structure, this first road which organizes the direction of the built environment, which constitute, let's say, a general structure for densification. But at some point we start the demolition being really a constant in this story. So we understand the drastic transformation of the plots, which is here really justified by this large demolition. And in fact, specifically in the last frame, you see in the gray here blue, let's say the new project which are envisaged in this area, which, as you can see, there is a total clash with the existing structure. So in this case, we find ourselves as a starting point, with this monofunctional productive area, but superposing this monofunctional productive area with what is in a way landing on this portion of the territory, we could define it again in the vocabulary of Carnegie and Maffei, an organic total, so meaning in a way organic elements in an organic ensemble where rationality is very difficult to grasp. And here they evolve through a path independence, because as a matter of fact, we see this merging of the plots, so this large demolition that in a way need to make space for a new rationality of space, new morphologies and new types. Now I would like to conclude, let's say, in saying that this could be, maybe, to discuss the basis for a method on, let's say, to explore how typo-morphological approach could contribute in addressing the question that I posed at the beginning. So which types of cities are emerging under the plurality of transition paradigm? And in a way, how this typo-morphological approach could be, first of all, a tool to uncover the forces that guide the spatial transformation, and also to unravel the spatial intentions which are behind this policy making, because of course, these projects are the result of very specific policies, and to reveal maybe also the degree of radicality to the project of the transition. So let's say a tool to render in a way less opaque certain dynamics, observing in a way how this transition paradigm lands on the territory, so really how it lands on the physical environment. And therefore, in a way, interpreting the paradigm of the transition through the space that it produces. And what could be interesting, in my opinion, could this idea of bringing together the critical consciousness that I was citing at the beginning, together with the reading of the rationalities of the urban fabric, which could be a starting point, especially since we are in a context where new rationalities are being explored through these new transition paradigms. And here I conclude.
Thank you, Elena. Any questions, comments, thoughts?
Thank you, Elena, for this presentation, which I thought it was super interesting and extremely pertinent also to the discourse on type, because actually it's really an explicit take on type, of course, on the urban scale. And I think that for me, the most important aspect of this work is, which I think is very urgent today, is to give a sort of morphological or architectural reading of spatial strategies. Because I think that today spatial strategies are extremely unclear. It's really something that has lost any spatial resolution, in fact. I mean, they're called spatial strategies, but you really don't understand how they really becomes concrete facts on the ground. And I think for me, what I really liked about your presentation, that I think you find the right keyword, which is the idea of the aggregate, which is in fact the idea of land use.
Yes.
And I think it's a really crucial, the land use or what you call the aggregate is extremely, for me, is the most important layer of the modern city. I mean, you cannot understand the modern city without understanding this layer, which you call the aggregate, which is the plot subdivision, basically. I mean, we were discussing this also in the case of Michela, that we cannot really understand the Villa Mania without understanding that it was actually the outcome of parcellization, of subdivision. And for that reason, I think, to me, in a way, you should, I think this kind of aspect of subdivision is really important. And somehow there should be a reading of it that has, I don't know, that goes into more depth in what is a subdivision, you know, the parcellization of land. And I think that, I don't know, I think you have to go deeper into that aspect.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
Because to me, one of the, and the reason I'm saying that, because if you want to be radical, let's say, in the sense that you should to really stress the biggest obstacle to a true ecological transition is the fact that our civilization is stuck on private property. And until we are not questioning this aspect, we will never solve this problem. I mean, we are doomed to failure. So, I mean, maybe take it as a very radical and maybe naive.
I've been circling around it for some time now,
Exactly.
so at some point I need to touch it.
Bernoulli actually, Bernoulli was right. I mean, if we don't socialize land use, meaning if we don't really find measures to overcome this obstacle, there will never be any transition. I mean, it will be just a rhetorical exercise, with very nice and good intentions, but there will never be a possibility of a radical replanning of the city, a radical restructuring of land use, which doesn't mean that we make tabula rasa. I think it means that we have to deal with this aggregate, because it at this point is not just land subdivision, is building types, is actually a specific fabric of the city. But I think that the idea of the legal, not the formal, but the legal resolution of property is the real problem in a way.
Thank you. Yes.
In fact, maybe the comments by Per Vittorio led me also to grasp a bit what you can mean with radicality. But I think my question also was just to re-explicit a bit in the way in which you deal with radicality, maybe as an objective in terms of a contribution that you can bring with your dissertation. But
yes,
there can be something like that. And then I had another question, but it went out. I'm coming back with the question.
Okay.
Go on.
Thank you so much, Elena. It was a really wonderful presentation, both methodologically, but I think also the material that you've shown us. I think actually the methodology that you constructed, actually working through maps, I find it incredibly, incredibly interesting, actually. Maybe I would have three comments or questions actually on three different levels. One is really a question. It is actually, why do you think it's important to call this it's a very stupid question, but maybe, it's basic more than stupid. Maybe. Why do you think we should call this approach typo-morphological rather than just morphological? Because my interpretation of that is that maybe by bringing in the typo, it's not a question of scale, but it's also a question of metabolism. In a way, I mean, morphology is rather is about form, so it means that it's somehow static, while type maybe brings in that kind of the way it works, let's say, not only the way it is. So that's a question maybe you can unfold later, but that's how I was reading it. And I think if you read it that way, that seems very interesting to me, because I studied in Switzerland, disclaimer, but I started to study actually in Italy along the last millennium, and we were fed these courses where typology and morphology were really pitched against each other. So I find it interesting here that you see them not, as you mentioned, not as different scales, but as two kind of complementary approaches, right? So I thought that was very productive somehow. And I find it particularly interesting because you're using a lot of quote unquote classical Italian literature, but then your definition of that is not at all classical, and it's actually your own, which I love. I think it's very, very interesting. Following on that, actually, if we continue on the question of how do you position yourself within a certain kind of, again, quote unquote, classical Italian literature on the subject, what I thought was very strong for me of your working method is that it seems to me like somehow it could go to complete the work that others have done on the formation of the European city. And I'm thinking particularly of Marco Romano, who has analyzed the logic, the enduring logic of collective facts. But he says very clearly in his books, I'm not really going to look at the mass, at the urban mass. I'm going to look at the emergencies, basically, so the collective facts, but not at the tissue so much, or the aggregate somehow. And you're almost like completing his theory by looking, in fact, on the contrary, at the kind of figure ground condition, right, that he didn't analyze. So the ground rather than the figure. But I think what you have in common with his analysis, which I find really interesting, is the idea that every urban environment has some kind of enduring qualities that can shift, can be resematized through time, but they do tend to endure, at least for a while. And of course, a while might mean some centuries. I think you're proving it to us with these maps. I find it very, very interesting that you are seeing situations of recurrence or persistent logic, again, not in the emergencies, so the monuments and so on and so forth, but in the tissue. That I found very, very interesting, because I think, I mean, Romano's theory is, to me, when I, you know, when I was taught by him, actually, in fact, and then I read his books, I found it such a simple but really powerful instrument to read the world around us. And but of course, it leaves us in the dark as to, you know, as to the aggregate or the ground of the figure. And I think you could really, you know, kind of fill in the blanks. But then I land at the end with a question that is not really a question to you, but I think it's more like a general question. It is a question of the transition paradigm. And my question is this transition a real thing, or is it an ideological, you know, debate, right? Because we know that time and again, many of the things that we discussed also today are not really a question of fact or stones, but they are a question of labeling terms, ways, you know, things are sold, ways that things are represented in maps and so on and so forth. So I would be really curious to see through your very, very accurate work through maps and so on and so forth, if you can, at a certain moment, actually maybe pronounce yourself on whether a transition is still an ideology, but maybe not yet a fact, or whether you do see some tangible you know, examples of that really taking place. Because that's a question that I have in general. That's a question that I have also in my own work. I find it very interesting that some of the transformations that then happen in languages, sometimes centuries before they actually happen on the ground. So, yeah, maybe I will let Brandon and you can start, right?
Yes.
Yeah, no, I think the questions that you set up are incredibly interesting and important, and it's a great. I like the definition of radical, but I think, yeah, following on from this last point, it seemed to me like somehow you were contending with how the city always changes, but how it always stays the same at the same time, or there are certain aspects that stay consistent, certain aspects that are changing and perhaps giving the appearance of a transition, etc. But of course, then many things are somehow just deepening or thickening, and so with that in mind, I'm really interested in the technique of the way that you're going about, in a sense, giving these historical X-ray almost of the city. But I wonder if that historical X-ray also has to become an X-ray. I mean, this may be totally outside of the scope of your department here, but for me, you know, one thing that was running through my mind as you were presenting the plots and these dash line divisions, disappearing and changing and shifting divisions. I mean, for instance, in Tokyo after the fire bombings in World War II, basically there were these utopian grand visions of a complete transformation of the city, etc. But basically the property lines remained exactly the same, and that was the reason why it couldn't overcome and really transition to something completely different. But on one hand, I'm wondering if that X-ray has to go to the legal, financial layer somehow more explicitly. This X-ray of the city that you're doing, because I wonder how that works within this context. But on the other hand, it strikes me that infrastructurally, there's something that's constantly thickening to make the city stay the same. So if we cut a section through the city at these different periods that you're working, what do we see in terms of the layering of the infrastructure somehow that's happening in the city to transition, constantly change, constantly progress, but then also somehow there's a thickening and solidifying of something that's happening at the very same time. It's equal and opposite movement in a way. So I don't know. I mean, that may be outside of the scope. I think the spatial questions are really interesting, but it just makes me, one thing, and I only say this is a critique because I really enjoy where it's going. I feel like the method of drawing has to somehow much more clearly convey basically the consequences of the things that you're looking at, or the actual fabric of the city that you're looking at somehow in a clearer way. I mean, I love the X-ray idea, but I wish that we could transition back at certain moments to other kinds of drawing or other kinds of imagery that would give a clear also formal morphological, let's say if we use that term, your term, reading of the city at the same time. So just to see these different layers if we're uncovering as a kind of X-ray exercise in a sense. So thanks.
Thank you.
So the question came in mind, yes, listening to you. In fact, my question was also this one related to that. The kind of inspiration that you use, Muratori from one side, from the other side, also the Atlas of Geneva, as a permanence, are also inspiration taken by tools that have consolidated a lot the architectural approach as a disciplinary one. I mean, these tools were as the effect really to define the boundary of an expertise and the discipline in a very, very strong way. So I wanted to know if there is something you are also affected a bit by this, and at the same time, in which way could you imagine to socialize this tool? Because we know there's also, in some cases, these tools had some conservative effects that they didn't want to have at the beginning. So this question a bit.
Yeah, actually, in fact, I think it's a very important issue, and I think this is really related to the hypothesis of the fifth typology, because in a way, I still think that the legacy of the Muratorian take on typology, especially also Caniggia, is, in my opinion, still valid, but it has to be plugged. I mean, as Elena was saying, it has to be socialized, also in terms of political economy. And that's the limit of the research, the limit of Muratori and Caniggia. Actually, in my opinion, because they focus really on the aggregate, they gave, especially Caniggia, an extremely powerful disciplinary tool to understand how politics, property becomes a concrete fact on the ground through the parcel, the aggregate. But then they stopped there.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Their school became really a sort of actually endless production of maps. A lot of maps, beautiful maps, I have to say. I mean, there is something almost crazy, in Caniggia's endless redrawing. I know I met some of his students, and he said, basically his studios we were not supposed to design anything, we just had to redraw maps.
But in fact, when I was reading in this book the description of the courses that he was doing, and he was very happy of this course, saying, I had 150 students walking around the city and mapping everything. And I was putting myself in the shoes of the student and said, okay, thank you, but maybe not.
No, actually, what is really, what became a problem in the Muratori school is that students were completely cut off from this understanding why, these maps. And of course, to me, the why is exactly the political economy. In a way, the aggregate is the best way to understand how spatial politics, I mean, you say the moment of decisions are then, becomes actually the problem of the habits, the way in which people just continue these patterns. Now, for me, I agree with the Brandon that beside the map, you need also another tool to give a representation of what is the result of this land user. So like to go back to Vasilis' idea of pattern, I think you need a pattern. I mean, somehow you need the more physical spatial experience. Maybe photography could be, it could be very interesting to see side by side the subdivision and then a photographic view of what is the pattern that this morphology of the aggregate produce, because I think that could be really interesting to have this also visual reference. It could help to understand the logic of the aggregate.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, this could also be the way, and maybe I reply also to some other questions in this sense, that if we intend morphology, like the most simple definition of morphology that comes for me into mind is probably how Ungars intends the morphology, and the book Morphology City Metaphors, where again with the transcolor approach, he looks at the shape of the form of the compact city, and then he looks also at the structure of the city, but then he looks also at the urban fabric, and each time it reminds not a different figure. But then again, also in that case, it doesn't do any step further. It remains still a way of looking at things just through their form. But in a way, if we can add, I don't know, an interpretation, which could be the interpretation of I don't know if it's translated tissue or fabric, because I actually read it in Italian some time ago, but like, if you think of the notion of the tissue of Lefebvre, for example, where we know that the tissue or the fabric is a support for a certain way of living, a certain way of inhabiting, and to sustain certain practices. And that's the point where we actually, in a way, feed this way of looking at things only through morphology in this sense. But this is also why I wanted to add the type in this context, because also in the case of Ungars and the morphology, but time is not there. It's just a static representation of things. And so through type, we add the dimension of time, which is also the dimension that makes us make values visible in the sense, because without that something can be there and then the next day not, and we forgot about it. But if we put in this, then we also understand certain values, which is another of the many crises we are undergoing today. So this one thing. Then I have a lot of things. Thank you for the Marco Romano. I am actually not very familiar, but I will look into it.
It's like literally looking at the negative, right?
Yeah.
So I think that to me, the link is in this question of continuity of the urban logic somehow, because he's also looking at continuities of urban logic, but he's looking at it from the polar opposite. And I think it's really interesting that you're looking actually at continuity or at urban logic, let's say, or the evolution of urban logic through the tissue rather than.
No, that's great. Thank you. And then the big question about the transition, I think this is a question that also for us at LabVIEW is a constant presence. We might call it in different ways, but we have to accept some things, which are the fact that at the level of policy making, at the level of the European Commission, there are some very specific things that are asked of us. And there is a very specific documents. There is the European Green Deal, which has been in act since 2019. And let's say the objectives posed by these documents, they have to be met in a way or another. And something that I find, I didn't talk about it today, but it's something that is kind of guiding me throughout my research, is that these policies are very politically charged and also ideologically charged. And especially this European Green Deal, which is actually guiding the way in which our cities are transforming today, especially cities like Paris, Berlin, like the big cities, and also this project I'm referring to is a very specific transition. As I was saying, we have different paradigms, and that paradigm is the one of the sustainable development, the green growth paradigm, the technical fix, and all this kind of block of things that basically try to sustain the business as usual model, without questioning anything, without just trying to change in a way the way in which we have our outputs, but we still want that outputs, those outputs, and so it's but they're still capitalist purely, so it's and then maybe we could, and that's to answer also to Ian, the radicality. In this sense, these are paradigms in a way touch and scratch the surface of the problem. Whilst if we invest in other paradigms, for instance, political ecology or other paradigms which say the problem is actually our patterns of overconsumption, overproduction, that's when we say, okay, this is a bit more radical, that we are following these roots a bit deeper. So that's, and then I got a bit lost with the questions. But,
I think maybe we should.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you
so much.